3 million years ago, back when the first groups of early humans began to appear on Earth, our protagonist was one of them. He seemed like any other Australopithecus at first glance, but there was something different about him, something that set him apart. Except having unusual obsession with hunting, MC thought he was just like everyone else, but soon he realized something was wrong about him. While others around him aged, weakened, and eventually died, he didn't. No matter what happened, he simply wouldn't die. Time passed. Eons came and went, but he stayed the same. Well, not exactly the same. While the years left no mark on him, his body kept changing, growing larger, stronger, and more powerful. In this endless passage of time, the only things that kept him going were hunting, fighting, and battling anything or anyone that seemed worth his time. As someone cursed with eternal life and unbearable loneliness, those were the only things that gave him any joy. For nearly 3 million years, he lived this way, his body evolving day by day, becoming stronger and stronger. Eventually, he reached a point where his strength was unmatched, so much so that others began calling him the god of Earth, Mu. His power grew to such an extent that he defeated every other god in existence, claiming the title of the strongest in the divine realm. But after that, things started to change. With no one left who could challenge him, his once thrilling days of combat and excitement turned into an endless stretch of boredom. To show just how fed up he was with his boring daily routine, Mu raised his foot and slammed it down on the ground beneath him. The entire dwelling of the gods, which looked like a small planet, shook violently from the impact. But that wasn't even the worst part. The whole divine realm started trembling like crazy, leaving every god, angel, and even the evils within it absolutely terrified. Of course, this wasn't the first time God Mu pulled a stunt like this, and there were some gods who simply couldn't take being shaken up every single day. One of them was Lucifer, the second-ranked god in the divine realm. Mu, completely bored, acted like he didn't care about the chaos he was causing. His mind was consumed with the same thought that had plagued him for centuries. He had defeated every single worthy opponent without breaking a sweat, and now it had been over 1,000 years since he'd faced anyone who could challenge him. Letting out a deep sigh, Mu muttered to himself, being too strong is a problem too. As the words left his mouth, something clicked in his mind. After 1,000 years of mindless frustration, he suddenly felt like a genius. If his strength was the problem, then the solution was simple. He needed to find a way to weaken himself. In his mind, it was obvious. If he could get a weak body like the Earthlings, he'd have hundreds of opponents to fight. Suddenly, Mu stood up from his seat and shouted, "Dragonling!" Out of nowhere, a massive dragon appeared in the sky above him, then descended to the ground with a thunderous landing. The dragon's height was at least 5 times bigger than God Mu's throne, and from the way it stood, it didn't seem too thrilled about being summoned. But that was just the way the dragon looked. Those glowing eyes belonged to the top god's assistant, and Dragonling was his name. Suddenly, his demeanor changed and let out a deep growl and asked why he had been called. To his surprise, God Mu simply started walking away and casually told Dragonling to take care of things while he was gone. However, things didn't go as smoothly as Mu expected. Out of nowhere, the dragon cast the spell Binding of the Absolute, and in a bold move, shackled God Mu in an attempt to stop him. But the moment Mu turned his head and gave him a side glance filled with anger, the dragon's entire demeanor shifted again. His fierce and wild attitude melted away, and he suddenly looked scared and ashamed. Stammering, the dragon tried to explain himself, saying he didn't mean to offend his lord, but that Mu should have at least given an explanation, especially since there was a gods meeting coming up soon. Mu, however, didn't give 2 flying fucks about the gods meeting. Without saying another word, he started walking again, dragging the dragon along with the chains like they were nothing. Seeing his first plan fail, Mu's assistant quickly switched tactics and started playing the victim. He whined, saying that if Mu didn't show up for the meeting, he'd be the one stuck dealing with the other gods' endless complaints about Mu's actions. In response, Mu effortlessly broke the binding spell as if it was nothing. He turned to the dragon and yelled, saying he wouldn't go anywhere if instead of that, the dragon agreed to fight him right now. That was all it took to completely change the assistant's attitude. Realizing that taking blame from the other gods was far better than being torn apart by God Mu, the dragon immediately wished him a safe and short trip. Mu smirked and walked toward what looked like a small version of Earth floating nearby. Stretching out his hand, he touched the surface of the mini-Earth. As he did, he began to wonder whose body he should choose to inhabit on Earth. To make the decision easier, he started listening in on the messages Earthlings were sending to the gods. Most of them were trivial and boring, but then one particular message caught his attention. It was a message that was questioning his very existence. At first, the message annoyed God Mu. However, it didn't take long for him to realize something. This person was the perfect choice for him to start his journey on Earth again. For the first time in 1,000 years, Mu felt genuinely excited. He had finally found a solution to his endless boredom. But while Mu couldn't have been happier, his assistant looked far less enthusiastic about the whole thing. For a brief moment, Mu thought about whether he should give some sort of explanation before leaving. But, true to his Sigma personality, he decided against it. Much to the dragon's surprise, he simply said goodbye, entrusted the place to him, and told him to take care of anyone who might show up in his absence. The dragon felt a mix of worry and frustration when he realized what was happening. God Mu was only sending his soul to Earth while leaving his body behind. Concerned, the dragon tried to remind him of the risks. If something happens to Mu's body while he's gone, his separated soul would also die on Earth. But Mu had already made up his mind. The idea that no one in the divine realm would dare even think about harming him gave him complete confidence that his body would be perfectly safe while he was away. Despite the dragon's attempts to stop him, though only through words, Mu brushed off his assistant's concerns and did what he wanted, just like always. Without further explanation, the scene abruptly shifted. It wasn't Mu anymore, but someone entirely different. Someone who had just defeated the demon lord after a grueling battle. The feeling of victory was overwhelming, and the person couldn't have been happier. But it wasn't real life. It was just the final scene of a video game that a player had finished moments ago. That player was a 17-year-old loser named Lee Ho. Lee Ho was painfully jealous of the heroes in every video game he played, those lucky protagonists who always managed to gather massive harems of cute girls during their ridiculous adventures. And as Lee Ho stared at the game credits rolling on his screen, he couldn't help but sigh, wishing his life were anything like theirs. Lee suddenly let go of his phone, and it slipped from his hand, falling as if from a great height. In mere seconds, the phone hit the ground with a loud crash, shattering into pieces. It was then clear why Lee Ho was standing on the edge of a 3-story building, ready to end his life. With nothing left to live for, his body trembling and covered in injuries, he whispered a bitter farewell to this cruel and unfair world before jumping. As he fell, the wind whipping past him, Lee screamed with tear-filled eyes from the depths of his despair. "If there's a god out there," he shouted, "now's your chance to prove it. Send me to another world." Before he could even finish his plea, he hit the ground with a sickening thud. Blood splattered everywhere, and his head smashed directly into the pavement. By all accounts, he should have been dead. But then, something strange happened. Lee's hands twitched, shaking uncontrollably. His chest heaved, and he suddenly started breathing heavily, like someone who had just been pulled from drowning. Unbeknownst to Lee, God Mu's soul had possessed his body in the blink of an eye right before he hit the ground. Now, Mu was forced to endure the unbearable pain of Lee's broken and battered body, completely unaware of what had just happened. Meanwhile, Lee's soul had been transported to the divine realm. He stood there, utterly shocked, his jaw practically on the floor. What shocked him wasn't just that he was in some otherworldly place, but that he was standing face to face with a towering dragon, one that definitely didn't look happy to see him. But the shock was mutual. The dragon, too, was stunned. He hadn't expected to see a human so soon in the divine realm, same as Lee that definitely hadn't expected the first thing he'd see after dying to be a massive, angry dragon glaring right at him. Let's take a moment to rewind and see what really happened just 10 seconds before this entire incident unfolded. God Mu was standing there with that signature smirk on his face, lightly touching the surface of the mini-earth in front of him. As I mentioned earlier, he wasn't the least bit worried about leaving his defenseless body behind. He had full confidence. Too much confidence, honestly. The dragonling tried to warn him, urging him to think this through. But Mu, reckless as ever, he brushed off the warnings like they were nothing. Without a second thought, he sent his soul hurtling towards Earth, swapping places with Lee Ho's soul. The very next moment, the unexpected happened. As soon as Mu's soul entered Lee's body, he realized he was in a dire life-or-death situation. No time to adjust, no warning. He was in mid-air, plummeting toward the ground at lightning speed. Less than a second. That's all the time he had to process the danger he was in. And then it happened. Lee's body hit the ground with such an incredible force that it was almost impossible to believe. The impact wasn't just devastating, it was catastrophic. Bones shattered into pieces. The body was flung backward like a rag doll before finally coming to a rest. The pain? It was beyond anything Mu had ever experienced in his immortal life. But the pain wasn't the worst part. What really hit him was the sheer confusion. Why? Why did this happen the moment he set foot, soul, on Earth? How did he end up in such a mess, and so quickly? None of it made any sense. His hands trembled uncontrollably at first, the shock coursing through his borrowed body. But then suddenly, everything went still. His hands stopped shaking. The realization dawned on him in that chilling, silent moment. He was dying. No chance to change his fate, no time to fix what was broken. And just like that, his lifeless body collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving ground. The area was eerily quiet, with no one around to witness the fall of what was once a proud and mighty god. No one to help, no one to even notice. But this wasn't the end for God Mu. Not yet. As you know, some human muscles move without conscious control. These are called involuntary muscles, like the heart and internal organs. For Mu, who had spent 3 million years training his body, he had reached the absolute peak of understanding the human form. This allowed him to consciously control every single part of his body, including his vessels and even his internal organs. Nothing was off limits for him. That was exactly how, just a few seconds after dying, his heart started beating again. The pain was excruciating, even for someone like Mu. But by forcing his blood to flow through his vessels and repairing his heart, he managed to stop the bleeding. Slowly but surely, Mu began to rise to his feet as if nothing had happened, even though his entire body was still screaming in pain. But instead of being angry about this chaotic situation, Mu found himself oddly happy. Beaten up, covered in blood. It had been so long since he felt anything like this. This feeling convinced him that he'd made the right choice to come here. His next move was to sift through Li Ho's memories to figure out what kind of life this guy had been leading. It didn't take long for him to learn everything about Li. With that knowledge, Mu decided to head back to Li's home, his new base, to figure out his next steps. Surprisingly, Mu found it difficult to walk with Li's weak and injured legs, so, like an ape, he used his hands to support himself, both to move faster and to take some of the pressure off his legs. Not long after, he finally reached Li's house, though the first thing he noticed was a cat had left a poop right in front of the window. As soon as he entered the small, basement-like house, Mu sat down on the creaky bed and started reflecting on what he had learned about Li's life so far. According to Li's memories, he only had one male relative, and that person lived far away from here. It didn't take long for Mu to realize that the guy he had chosen not only lived alone, but was also poor and utterly miserable. His only occupation seemed to be attending some place called school. What amused Mu the most, though, was the memory of someone at school who seemed to have made it their life's mission to bully Li. Not only did this person constantly pick fights with him, but they also went out of their way to make Li's life a living hell. This, to Mu, was exactly the kind of starting point he had hoped for. It was messy, chaotic, and full of potential for challenges. He couldn't be happier about it. Feeling a surge of excitement, Mu threw a random punch into the air to celebrate, but the moment he did, a sharp and unexpected pain shot through his right arm. It felt as if the muscles in his arm had torn apart. Something was definitely wrong. Mu figured the pain in his arm was probably because of how he had overused his hand muscles while awkwardly crawling back home. It became pretty obvious that this body hadn't seen much action. The first thing Mu noticed was that Li had almost never used his arm muscles for anything strenuous, so even the simplest effort left them sore. Still, instead of feeling frustrated or angry about being stuck in such a weak body, Mu smirked. In fact, he was genuinely happy to feel pain like this, after thousands of years of living without it. The next day, the police discovered the bloodstains and shattered glasses at the scene where Li Ho's body had crashed to the ground. They quickly roped off the area, forbidding anyone from entering as they launched their investigation. Meanwhile, Mu casually returned to the crash scene, not to check on the investigation though. The real reason he was there was because that 3-story building near the scene was none other than Li's school, and Mu had decided to keep up with Li's daily routine. He strolled into the school, scanning the halls until he found Li's classroom. His excitement got the better of him as he slid the rail door open with way too much force. The door rebounded and slammed back into him, smacking him squarely and leaving Mu momentarily stunned. His triumphant moment was completely ruined. Muttering to himself, he slowly stepped into the classroom, drawing the attention of one of Li's classmates. The boy was immediately annoyed by the noise Li made as he entered the classroom. He shot him an irritated glare and called him "Idiot Li Ho," telling him to keep it down. Hearing this, Mu completely forgot about the pain in his face and began walking toward the boy. Mu stopped right in front of him, standing uncomfortably close, which left the boy momentarily shocked, but it wasn't Li's weak and frail appearance that surprised him. It was the unsettling, creepy smile on Mu's face. In that instant, Mu recognized this boy as the bully from Li's memories, the one who always made his life miserable. The bully, completely unaware that Li Ho was no longer the same person, scoffed and mocked him. "What's wrong with you, huh? Did you leave your glasses at home? Or are you just too blind and stupid to act normal today?" Before Mu could even respond, the boy suddenly swung his fist and punched him square in the face, as if to reassert his dominance over Li. The punch landed hard, and blood started dripping from Mu's nose and mouth, pooling on the floor beneath him. The bully smirked, clearly proud of himself, and mocked him again. "What happened to your glasses? Did you sell them for cash or something? Or did you just lose them like the idiot you are?" Even with the blood running down his face, Mu didn't flinch. He stood there calmly, unfazed by the punch. When it came to fighting, Mu had his own unshakable rules. To him, a proper and honorable fight could only begin when all parties involved had willingly shown their intent to fight. And right now, Mu was waiting for the right moment to respond. As someone always ready to face any opponent, whether it's a god, a beast, or a human, Mu's only concern was confirming his opponent's intent to fight. And the way Mu chose to confirm that intent was simple. He would stand still and take the opponent's first strike. That's exactly what happened here. After taking the punch, the familiar excitement and satisfied smile spread across Mu's face. Without any hesitation, Mu sprang into action, interrupting the bully mid-sentence with a sudden punch aimed directly at him. The boy, completely caught off guard, took the punch squarely, just as Mu had moments ago. But as Mu pulled his hand back, a sharp, unbearable pain shot through his arm. His muscles felt like they were tearing apart again, a brutal reminder that this wasn't his indestructible godly body, but a fragile, weak human one. The commotion quickly caught the attention of the teacher, who stormed over, shouting angrily and demanding that they stop fighting immediately. But by now, the noise had also drawn the interest of the entire class. Heads turned, curious and intrigued by the sight of a fight breaking out in the middle of the room. The bully, feeling humiliated and furious after being punched by a nerd for the first time in his life, couldn't contain his anger any longer. Ignoring the teacher's yelling and the watching crowd, he charged straight at Mu, ready to unleash his fury. Mu immediately tried to defend himself and managed to block most of the attacks. Well, kind of. While defending, he couldn't help but think that he would have ended this fight a long time ago if his new body could actually keep up with him. For a brief moment, he considered using some of his godly powers. But to his shock, they didn't work. That moment of disbelief distracted him, and before he knew it, he took another punch to the face. At least this one wasn't as hard as the last one. The bully wasn't about to back off from the person he believed was Lee, not until he made him regret throwing that first punch. On the other hand, Mu found himself in a pretty bad spot. He couldn't muster the strength to fight back with this weak body. No punches, no kicks, and without his godly powers, he was left with only one option. In a sudden move, he lowered his head, aiming at a specific spot, and took the incoming punch directly on his skull. The bones of his skull were the only part of this body that he could count on. Just as he expected, the bully's fist slammed into his head, and the impact immediately made the guy break the bones in his fingers. The pain was so intense that the bully screamed like a baby, and in that moment Mu couldn't help but feel like an absolute genius. To put an end to this ridiculous fight, Mu decided to take advantage of the bully's distraction before he could recover. This time, he was the one who rushed forward, grabbing the bully's hand in a sudden move. Without wasting a second, he used his head to strike, aiming directly at the guy's stomach or maybe even his balls, knowing most guys' weak spots are right there. The bully was caught completely off guard, unable to handle yet another wave of unbearable pain at the same time. But Mu wasn't done yet. He wanted to make sure this guy would never forget this day for the rest of his life. With another swift move, Mu raised his head and slammed it into the bully's jaw. This time, the pain was too much for the bully to handle. His eyes rolled back and he dropped to his knees in front of Mu like a defeated loser before finally passing out. All of this happened while everyone else stood there in shock, recording the entire fight. Watching the weakest guy in school take down one of the school's biggest bullies wasn't something anyone could believe so easily. But for Mu, things were different. He had just fought someone for the first time in thousands of years, using every bit of strength he could muster. The feeling was incredible, but now wasn't the time to celebrate. As his excitement faded, the pain from all the hits he'd taken came rushing in all at once. He could taste the sticky, metallic flavor of blood in his mouth. At first, it didn't seem like something even God Mu could handle so easily, but it only took a moment for him to realize something surprising. He was more than okay with it. After such a long, hard time, it actually felt satisfying to experience the pain of a good fight again. A few moments later, when Mu's excitement finally settled, he stared at the unconscious boy's body like he wasn't done with him yet. Mu sat down next to him, and for some reason, probably because the boy gave him such a tough fight, he thanked him. Then, in a completely unexpected move, Mu leaned in, lowered his head, opened his mouth wide, and bit the boy's ear, making blood splatter everywhere. But Mu didn't just bite the ear. He actually tore off a small piece of it and spat it onto the ground right in front of all his classmates. Horror filled the air. None of the students could believe what Mu had just done. It was like watching a crazy person. Mu, however, didn't care at all about what anyone thought. He calmly wiped the blood off his face, still glaring at the boy's body, who, even after losing part of his ear, didn't so much as twitch. This wild act of biting off the bully's ear was actually Mu's way of leaving a mark on his opponent, someone who had given him a fight that he truly enjoyed. It was his twisted way of showing gratitude, while also marking them as someone worthy of his attention. These opponents were later referred to as Mu's playthings. However, it was clear, Only strong opponents who gave him exciting battles could earn a spot on this list. Back then, being called one of Mu's playthings was almost like a badge of honor, a symbol of strength. Ironically, in a way, it was similar to how humans in some eras would mark animals to show they had been neutered, except Mu's mark wasn't about humiliation, but recognition. Soon enough, the story of the second-year bully who got beaten by the weakest guy in school spread faster than lightning. The most shocking part for everyone wasn't just that the bully got beaten, it was that he basically got neutered. The boy's condition was so bad that they had no choice but to call emergency medical services to come and take care of him. Like all the other curious students, Mu was also watching as they transferred Lee's classmate to the hospital. Of course, Mu didn't care about his health. He was more curious about how they managed to call for help so quickly using just a mobile phone. As the ambulance drove